This project is a long time in coming. It comes out of a long interest I've had in a number of different questions, including the nature of military forces and also the nature of the sources that discuss military forces during the Middle Ages. And so in this paper I'll be talking about both of those issues and tangentially talking about knights, only though very, very briefly. So thank you. The military history of the German kingdom in the 11th century remains to be written. The most recent monographic treatment that considers the salient kings at war, Brüner Sheriff's 1985 dissertation, Studien zum Heer der Autonen und der Ersten Salier, ends with the death of King Henry III in 1056, and is notable for the topics that it explicitly avoids, including military equipment, logistics, numbers, military levies, fortifications, and above all, sieges. There are no monographic studies of the conquest of the Burgundian kingdom by King Conrad II of Germany in his two-year campaign of 1033 to 1034, and if anyone needs a dissertation topic, that's a good one. Since the end of the 19th century, scholars have assiduously avoided investigating the wars of Conrad II, Henry III, and Henry IV in Poland and in Hungary. Even the civil wars within Germany during the final quarter of the 11th century and the first decade of the 12th, which have received considerable attention from a political perspective, and here the investiture controversy is very important, have inspired only limited commentary regarding military matters. At an even more basic level, the enormous volume of source materials pertaining to warfare in the salient century, including narrative texts, letters, charters, and archaeological evidence, have not received the kind of detailed critical analysis that has become the norm in Anglo-Saxon, Carolingian, and increasingly Ottonian military history, and one could add Anglo-Norman military history as well. The lack of scholarly attention to the military history of the German kingdom generally, and to the salient period in particular, is due to several factors. First, until very recently, non-German speaking scholars, including military historians, generally have avoided the history of Germany altogether, although happily that is beginning to change. Second, German-speaking historians largely have avoided topics in military history, especially since the end of the Second World War, although God knows why. Finally, the one consistent exception to this aversion to military matters, namely the focus on social and economic questions regarding the relationship among military service, nobility, and feudalism, actually has served to hinder a thorough investigation of the nature and conduct of war and the concomitant examination of its institutional, material, and human elements. A brief overview of the historiographical tradition will help to illuminate the current limited state of understanding of warfare in Germany in the pre-Crusade period. In his classic study, Der Reiterdienst und die Anfänge des Lehnwesens, first published in 1887, Heinrich Brüner made the case for Charles Martel's rapid transformation of Frankish military organization from large armies of men on foot to much smaller armies of mounted warriors. Brüner argued that Charles Martel, having defeated an army of mounted Muslims with an infantry phalanx in the Battle of Poitiers, now sought to develop a cavalry army that could face the Muslims in battle. The implicit paradox in this argument was never fully explained by Brüner. In order to achieve this new army, Charles is depicted as having borrowed large numbers of estates from the church and granting these as beneficia to his loyal supporters so that they could purchase and maintain horses that were suitable for mounted combat. Brüner averred that because these mounted troops were so much more militarily effective than the foot soldiers whom they replaced, Charles Martel simply stopped mobilizing the latter and relied on his new cavalry army. The ultimate consequence of this change in military organization of the Frankish kingdom was that only those men who could equip themselves with war horses were now militarily viable. The bulk of the population, which was now excluded from military service, declined in social, economic, and political status. This new warrior aristocracy and their beneficed retainers thus took their place alongside the king as the major new figures in the feudal order. Military historians in the late 19th and 20th century generally did not accept Brüner's model of a rapid transformation of Frankish military organization toward an army that was composed exclusively of mounted warriors, not least because Carolingian military legislation from the 9th century clearly indicated that foot soldiers continued to be mobilized for combat operations. However, Brüner's argument that mounted military service provides the key to understanding both the establishment of a warrior nobility and the development of feudalism did win widespread approval from scholars in the period both before and after the Second World War. For example, And here I've cut down about 20 pages into 4. For example, the Austrian scholar Leopold Auer argued with regard to vassalic contingents that, quote, "We are dealing here with a fundamental issue of medieval military history, namely the central question of the relationship between war and social structure, or put another way, the relationship between status and the obligation to undertake military service." He added that, quote, "Heavily armored mounted men increasingly comprised the core of the army from the time of Pippin III onwards, while foot soldiers retreated in importance. The material demands that resulted from the situation, above all the possession of a horse and a breastplate, were too high for the great mass of the free men, particularly in light of the increasing number of wars. The result was that participation in offensive campaigns, that is, expeditionary duty, increasingly was limited to the wealthier strata of the population," unquote. Auer did accept that members of the lower social orders, and here I'm avoiding class terminology in case someone gets upset, continue to be mobilized for territorial defense, that is Landfolge, into the 11th century in periods of emergency. By contrast, Auer claimed those members of the lower social orders found on campaign were there merely as servants or attendants in the baggage train. Joseph Fleckenstein drew similar conclusions in his study on the intertwined development of the nobility and the nature of military organization in the Frankish Empire. And here, Fleckenstein focused again on Carolingian capitularies and identified a 3-stage process in which the position of free-fighting men was weakened relative to the vassals of great magnates, culminating in 847 Capitulary of Meissen, in which counts disappear and only signores appear, which Fleckenstein interpreted to mean that only vassalic contingents were now mobilized and that the free peasant levies were no longer utilized for military service. These arguments regarding the transformation of Frankish military organization and the concomitant domination of warfare by vassalic contingents of noble mounted warriors were further developed in the context of Ottonian history, most notably by Karl Leiser, who argued that warfare in this period was dominated by aristocrats and their noble vassals, who were distinguished by their mastery of equestrian combat. In contrast to scholars such as Fleckenstein, however, Leiser looked at this change in the 10th rather than in the 9th century. The views of scholars such as Fleckenstein and Leiser have had an enormous influence on subsequent scholarship up to the present day. With just a few notable exceptions, and Chuck Bolus unfortunately couldn't be here, but he is one of them, over the past century, the transition to armies consisting of vassalic contingents of mounted knights with the concomitant disappearance of Carolingian-style expeditionary levies has been taken for granted by specialists in the history of Ottonian and Salian Germany. I have argued elsewhere that this model is ill-suited to describe warfare under the Ottonians. And you can buy that book in the bookstalls. My focus today will be on ascertaining whether this consensus among scholars is justified with regard to the 11th century. Was warfare in the Salian period truly dominated by groups of knightly vassals who fought cavalry battles against other knightly vassals in feudal warfare? Was it really the case, as one scholar claimed, that, quote, "the grotesque situation was in force, that the nobility built fortifications that could only be defended on foot, but continued to hold fast to the principle of only fighting on horseback," unquote. In sum, is it true that military forces, which might be characterized as non-noble levies, did not exist in 11th century Germany? This paper addresses 2 issues that have the potential to illuminate these questions and the broader military organization of Germany under the Salian dynasty. First, how does the party pris of the narrative sources from the 11th century affect their depiction of warfare? Second, what do these same authors have to say about the role played by non-milites in the conduct of war? Before returning to these questions, however, it is useful to make a few observations about the milites who populate the pages of 11th century narrative works. In general, it is these milites who have been identified by many scholars either as feudal knights or as beneficed vassals of lords, who dominated warfare through their monopoly on mounted combat. However, the identification of milites as either knights or vassals cannot be sustained for 11th century Germany. First, the term miles, plural milites, retained its traditional meaning as a fighting man, and more particularly as a professional soldier throughout the 11th century in Germany. Second, the sources for this period provide no basis for concluding that men denoted as milites possessed a legal or social status that differentiated them from other laymen on the basis of their identity as milites. The term designates a professional rather than a legal or social status. Nor is there any basis in the sources for concluding that most, or even many, milites were men with high social status. Rather, the opposite is true. Most milites were men of low social status and could be killed with impunity in sieges and on the battlefield, as illuminated by the fact that contemporary observers felt no need to identify them by name or even give numbers of their deaths. In addition, it is clear that although some milites did possess beneficia, many did not, and received wages, that is, stipendia, for their military service. Finally, although some milites can be shown to have possessed horses, and even to have ridden them in combat, most milites appear in the narrative sources of the 11th century as garrison troops in fortifications or in armies besieging fortifications where horses were of limited utility. In turning back to the problem of non-milites who served in warfare, it must be emphasized that much of the argument for the transformation of the military organization of the Frankish Empire and its successor states, whether under the Carolingian or the Ottonians, depends upon the reading of legal texts, such as capitularies and Landfrieden, in isolation from narrative sources. Those scholars who do adduce evidence from narrative sources to support the contention that military levies gradually disappeared, whether in the 9th or in the 10th century, tend to use examples that are not treated in context, particularly with regard to the role that these passages are intended to play in the author's overall account. From a methodological perspective, selecting isolated or unrepresentative passages from narrative works in order to suit a scholar's chosen conclusion is particularly problematic. It is well understood that medieval authors in general, and 11th century authors in particular, were not engaged in a transparent effort to reveal the past as it really happened. Rather, authors in the pre-Crusade period, most of whom were aristocratic clerics, were heavily biased, not only in favor of their particular patrons, but also towards members of their own families, and more broadly towards individuals characterized by an elevated social and economic status. In the context of writing military history, these biases are manifested in the considerable attention given to relatively small numbers of aristocrats engaged in combat operations, but also on occasion in the denigration of members of the lower social orders for rhetorical purposes. As a consequence, when medieval writers note only the deaths of aristocrats in battle, this cannot be understood ipso facto as evidence that non-aristocrats were absent from the battlefield. Similarly, when these same authors write disparagingly about men with low social status serving on military campaign, it is incumbent upon the historian to determine whether this passage is reflective of reality or whether the author is indulging his biases for rhetorical purposes. A couple of examples will help illuminate this problem. Brüner of Merseburg, a Saxon aristocrat and cleric who was employed by both the Archbishop of Magdeburg and the Bishop of Merseburg during the course of the 1070s and 1080s, devoted considerable attention throughout his history of the Civil War in Germany, the Saxonicum Bellum, to lauding and highlighting the positive contribution of nobles and the crude, violent, and uncivilized behavior of peasants and others in the lower strata of society. Brüner's hostility to the lower social orders manifests itself on several occasions in military contexts. Brüner claims, for example, that during the siege of Würzburg in August 1077, the anti-king Rudolf of Rheinfelden was reluctant to capture the city by storm because he feared that he would not be able to keep the lower class elements in the army in check and stop them from looting churches and stealing clerical property once they overwhelmed the defenders. Consequently, according to Brüner, Rudolf preferred to deploy his troops in a lengthy and expensive siege rather than risk the dishonor that would result from allowing a successful assault of the city by the vulgar crowd, an assault that he believed would lead to the destruction of sacred sites. In evaluating this passage, it seems unlikely that Rudolf refrained from launching an assault on Würzburg, a crucial fortress city on the frontier of Saxony and Franconia, simply because he feared what the undisciplined Vulgus would do once inside the walls. It is rather more probable that he feared to sustain the heavy casualties that would result from attempting to storm this well-defended fortress city. What is clear, however, is that Brüner wanted his audience to believe that the Vulgus was responsible for Rudolf's failure to capture the city, and that he expected his readers to find it plausible that the Vulgus not only was present as part of the besieging army, but that these lower-class men would play an important role in any assault against the city. Another author who sometimes indulges in gratuitous attacks on those whom he viewed as his social inferiors is Lambert of Hersfeld. For example, In his account of the rebellion by the citizens of Cologne against their archbishop in 1074, Lambert castigates the former for their soft manner of life and their inability to understand the true rigors of the military life. Lambert claims, quote, "It is not difficult to move men of this kind in any way that you might wish. Just like a leaf is seized by the wind, because they are raised from their youth with the delights of the city, and they never have any experience in war. After selling their wares, they are accustomed to discuss military matters over wine and food," sounds like us, "and think about anything that might occur to them. No sooner is said than done. They have no idea how this will end." Lambert was a strong partisan of the Thuringian and Saxon nobility, who were engaged in a lengthy rebellion against King Henry IV. In addition, he demonstrates throughout his Annales an acute sense of the rights of ecclesiastical magnates. So it is hardly surprising that he chooses to denigrate townsmen who not only oppose their bishop, but are also strong supporters of Henry IV. Even when keeping these biases in mind, however, when one considers this passage in isolation, the reader is left with the image of fat burghers, boasting around the dinner table about the great feats of military prowess that they plan to achieve. Certainly such men could be of little value on the battlefield. However, reading further, one finds that Lambert paints a very different picture of the actual military effectiveness of the population of Cologne. He presents the populace marching to the archiepiscopal palace, equipped with helmets and armor, as the light of flaming torches gleamed off the points of their swords. After a brief fight, they drove the archbishop and his military household from the city. As these examples suggest, the biases of the narrative sources are toward the depiction of the kind of aristocratic warrior nobility identified by scholars such as Auer, Fleckenstein, and Leiser. In addition, the tendency of aristocratic authors to use images of their social inferiors to make rhetorical points often has been interpreted as indicative of the lack of military effectiveness of non-noble combatants. However, such conclusions do not take into account the biases of the aristocratic authors of the narrative sources, authors who were focused on the exploits of their aristocratic audiences and frequently used men of lower social and economic status to make rhetorical points. In light of these pervasive biases, it is clear that arguments from silence regarding the absence of men of lower social status in campaign have a rather high hurdle to meet. It is methodologically unsound to conclude that such men were not on campaign simply because authors who were not interested in them did not mention them. Concomitantly, when authors do discuss the presence of fighting men from the lower social orders on campaign, this must be understood as going against their natural tendencies, and therefore having more significance as a result. Similarly, when aristocratic authors mention the effective military performance of men with low social and economic status, this too must be taken seriously as going against their general tendencies and biases. When evaluating the information presented in 11th century narrative sources, several other factors also require attention. First, authors of the main narrative texts for the 11th century, such as Berthold of Reichenau, Lambert of Hersfeld, Brüner of Merseburg, Bernold of Constance, the anonymous author of the Vita Heinrici, were very careful in their discussion of military matters to distinguish between milites, who were members of the military households of secular and ecclesiastical magnates, and other types of fighting men. Second, these authors also were inclined to see themselves as operating in the Isidorian tradition of history, in which the narrator was responsible for discussing events that actually happened in the past, insofar as this reality served the rhetorical objectives of the text. Finally, these authors also appear to have accepted the imperatives of the Ciceronian tradition of historical writing that required the presentation of a plausible framework in which to tell a story to an audience that was familiar with the broader topic, but not necessarily with the details of particular events. As a consequence, when authors indicate that a man in a particular military force was not a miles, the proper conclusions to draw are first, that such troops were not members of the military households of magnates, and second, that the audience for these narrative texts found it plausible that non-professional fighting men served in military operations. In this context, the authors under discussion here tend to treat the participation of non-milites in offensive military operations in two ways. One, the use of the presence of such men in order to make a rhetorical point, and two, the formal distinction between milites and other troops who are participating in a battle or a siege. As I noted above, Brüner of Merseburg chose to blame the failure of Rudolf of Rheinfelden to capture Würzburg in 1077 on his ostensible fear that the Vulgus in his army would get out of hand when the city was taken. This use of men from the lower social orders as a rhetorical foil in support of the author's party creed is a common topos in the narrative text of this period. Brüner himself utilized this ploy again when discussing the outbreak of a widespread rebellion against Henry IV and the junction of rebel, and I emphasize rebel, Saxon and Swabian armies in the Rhineland in autumn of 1076. Although they were now allies, the Saxon and Swabian princes feared to bring their armies into a single camp, according to Brüner, because they were worried about the potential for violence between their men. The two armies had fought on the opposite sides the previous year at the Battle of Unstrut, 9 June 1075, and many men in both the Swabian and Saxon armies were nursing grievances. Brüner specifically comments that it was the men of the lower social orders, the viles personae, who posed the greatest source of concern for the commanders. As it turned out, there was no violence between the Saxon and Swabian armies, and as a result of their unity, Henry IV was forced to sue for peace and promised to seek absolution from Pope Gregory VII for his sins. However, Brüner was able to use this scene to pursue his agenda of demonstrating the moral superiority of aristocrats as contrasted with the viles personae. Brüner again points to the difficulties of employing men of lower social orders on campaign in his discussion of the battle between Rudolf of Rheinfelden and King Henry IV on the Elster River on 14 October 1080. Before the battle began, the Saxon army was divided into two parts, with the intention of catching the royalist forces in a pincer. Mounted troops under the direct command of Rudolf approached the royal camp from the west, but were met and defeated by Henry IV's own mounted forces, and I'm happy to say Rudolf was mortally wounded. The Saxon foot soldiers, under the command of Otto of Nordheim, the former Duke of Bavaria, approached the royal camp from the north, cutting through a densely wooded area that Henry and his advisors had believed was impassable. When the Saxon foot soldiers launched their attack on Henry IV's camp, the surprise was complete, and the Saxons drove the king's men into the waters of the White Elster River, where many of them are reported to have drowned. Clearly, the foot soldiers of the Saxon levy acquitted themselves quite well in this battle. However, Brüner again permitted his bias against men in the lower social orders to come to the fore when describing the aftermath of this victory. According to Brüner, once the royalists had been driven off, the entire focus of the Saxon soldiers was on looting King Henry's camp so they could satisfy their greed and keep all of the booty for themselves. Brüner asserts they were only restrained from indulging their foolish desires by the good sense of the nobleman Otto of Nordheim, who warned the foot soldiers to stay away from the royal camp until it was clear that all enemy troops had been defeated. The Saxon soldiers did obey Otto's commands, which indicates that they could follow orders even when these were contrary to their perceived interests, although Brüner didn't mean it in that way. Lambert of Hersfeld, despite his hostility toward the urban levy of Cologne, noted above, was less inclined than his contemporary Brüner to engage in the wholesale denigration of men from the lower social orders in military matters. This was particularly the case in regard to those men who opposed Henry IV, the anti-hero of Lambert's Annales. However, when discussing military matters, Lambert did play on what would seem to have been the anti-peasant biases of many aristocrats. For example, in his account of the days leading up to the Battle of the Unstrut, Lambert took pains to explain why King Henry and his advisors were so confident about engaging their Saxon opponents. Henry had dispatched scouts, exploratores, to determine the size and disposition of the Saxon army. The scouts reported back that although these Saxons equaled the royal army in numbers and were equipped in roughly the same manner, the royal troops were otherwise superior in every other way for battle. In discussing whether to advance against the Saxon camp, the king's advisors, according to Lambert, stressed that they had a picked force. By contrast, the majority of the Saxons were peasants, rustici, and comprised therefore an inept rabble, ineptus vulgus, who were more accustomed to agricultural labor than to military service. The king's advisors added that the Saxons lacked the military spirit that was necessary for war and had been mobilized because of fear of their princes. Consequently, these peasants could not be expected to stand and fight once the battle began and sword was raised against sword. In fact, they would certainly flee the battle before it even began, terrified by the noise as the two armies approached each other. In discussing the battle itself, Lambert takes considerable pains to show that this assumption by the king's advisors was ill-founded. The Saxon troops, including the Vulgus, initially gave a very good account of themselves in the fighting before ultimately being driven from the field. While not so subtly mocking the assumptions by Henry and his advisors about the lack of military skill of the Saxon peasantry, Lambert himself indulges in this very same rhetorical theme in his description of the aftermath of the battle with regard to the men of the lower social orders who were serving in the royal army. As Lambert makes clear, following a lengthy battle, the Saxon line was shattered by simultaneous attacks on both flanks by Henry's troops. In discussing the subsequent rout of the Saxons, Lambert, drawing upon Sallust's description of the retreat of an army in the Jugurthine War, observed, quote, "As is always the case when the enemy flees, the most cowardly and the most courageous are equally brave in pursuit." Lambert then made the severe observation that all of the royal troops went off in pursuit of the fleeing Saxons, quote, "even the plebeians and the peasants who usually hung around the camp doing servile work," unquote. Lambert's contention here regarding the plebei ac rustici could, if taken out of context by scholars seeking evidence for the military marginalization of the rustici, be utilized to show that men of this status had only ancillary roles in the military campaigns as servants, cooks, attendants for horses, and other such menial tasks. However, as we shall see below, this is not accurate. In addition to using rustici and plebei as rhetorical foil in his discussion of the pursuit of the Saxons at the Battle of the Unstrut, Lambert also addresses Henry IV's mobilization of non-milites in an effort to show how little support the king had from the magnates for his war against the Saxons. This is a political rather than a military observation by Lambert. In the context of the initial Saxon and Thuringian rebellion of July 1073, Henry tried to divert an army that he had mobilized for operations in Poland to suppress the widespread revolt against his rule in Saxony. However, Henry's secular and ecclesiastical magnates refused to consider this plan. Consequently, Henry dismissed the army, but sent messengers to all of the principes in the kingdom, announcing that he would be mobilizing a new army in early October that was to join him at the villa of Brendingen near Hersfeld. The specific purpose of this army was to undertake operations in Saxony against the rebels. Lambert takes pains to stress that on this occasion, the royal messengers were dispatched not only to the princes, but to the people as well, non solum principibus sed et popularibus. As Lambert makes clear, Henry's decision to mobilize the populace was inspired in no small measure by his fear that the magnates either would not come to the muster of Brendingen or would not fight if they did come to the campaign. It turns out that King Henry was right to be worried. The German princes refused to fight, and instead compelled him to make a peace agreement with the Saxons and Thuringians at the villa of Gerstungen in the autumn of 1073. With his options now limited in regard to Saxony, Henry turned his attention to the potentially advantageous request by his brother-in-law Salonal to help him regain the Hungarian throne. In return for his aid, Henry would receive a series of frontier fortifications in Hungary that would help ensure that the Hungarians would no longer be able to raid Bavaria. Henry therefore issued summonses in July 1074 to his principes, ordering them to mobilize for the campaign in Hungary. But the principes refused, citing the costs that they had just undertaken for the expedition in Saxony the previous year. As a consequence, Lambert claims Henry was forced to begin his Hungarian campaign with a very limited military force, comprising just the royal military household and the force of non-professional fighting men, whom Lambert denotes as the common herd, the gregaries. In addition to the mentions of rustici, plebii, viles personae, gregarii, and the vulgus in military campaigns for the purpose of making a rhetorical point, the authors of narrative sources also routinely distinguish between milites and other types of troops when discussing the mobilization and deployment of fighting men for military operations. The Swabian author Berthold of Reichenau, for example, emphasized that when Henry IV returned to Germany from Canossa in June 1077, he mobilized a large army in order to crush the rebels who were opposed to his rule. Berthold distinguished among these various forces, noting the presence of Henry's own milites, as well as the troops provided by the Swabian bishops of Basel and Strasbourg, and the secular magnate Count Palatine Hermann. These household troops are contrasted with the substantial auxiliary force, non modica auxiliarium militia, of Bavarians and Carinthians, almost the entire strength, virtus of Burgundy, and a substantial force, non modica pars, of the Franconians. Berthold, who was very precise in his use of military terminology, used terms other than milites to denote the Bavarians, Carinthians, Burgundians, and Franconians. This was his way of signaling to his audience that these forces included non-milites in their ranks. As we will see below, many of these men were in fact rustici. Lambert of Hersfeld also frequently used the technique of distinguishing between milites and other types of troops, and used a variety of terms to denote the latter, including exercitus and topii. In his discussion of the initial phases of the Battle of the Unstrut noted above, Lambert conspicuously does not draw the attention to the milites in the royal army, but rather observes that the exercitus of the Swabians and the exercitus of the Bavarians retreated after suffering considerable losses at the hands of Otto of Nordheim's Saxon troops. And remember, they were rustici. As noted above, these Saxon... Lambert then makes clear that the royal position on the battlefield was salvaged when the milites from the military households of the Count of Glisborg and the Bishop of Bamberg struck the Saxon line on the two flanks, followed up by cavalry forces provided by the Duke of Bohemia and the Dukes of Lotharingia. As noted earlier, Brüner of Merseburg, writing independently of Lambert, observed that the Swabian forces at the Battle of the Unstrut included viles personae, who were still angry about the losses that they had suffered at the battle at the hands of the Saxons. The presence of such men in the Swabian battle line certainly helps to explain Lambert's decision to note the entire Swabian force as the exercitus of the duchy, rather than as a congeries of military households of Swabian magnates, i.e. milites, since the Swabians included a mixed group of professional and non-professional fighting men. The anonymous author of the Carmen de Bello Saxonico, a panegyric written on behalf of King Henry just after his victory on the Unstrut in 1075, similarly distinguishes between milites and other types of troops in his discussion of the mobilization of the Saxons to defend their homeland in early 1074. He claims that as word spread throughout Saxony to prepare for war, the rustici cast aside their farming implements, the pastores left their flocks, and the mercatores abandoned their wares. These men from every station and every profession girded themselves for war. The poet then declared that this varied force of farmers, shepherds, and merchants, equipped with whatever arms they had available, joined with the milites and rushed off to war. Many more examples of distinctions between milites and other types of troops can be deduced from the works of contemporary authors, but in the interest of time, we'll switch to a new and final topic. The examples treated thus far indicate that non-milites, that is, men outside the military households of magnates, played a substantial role in combat operations. One important question, however, is the extent to which the mobilization of such men can be understood as routine rather than as ad hoc. Two authors working independently from each other and in different regions of the German kingdom, Berthold of Reichenau and Lambert of Hersfeld, give indications that the mobilization of such men was not an ad hoc response to the exigencies of a particular campaign. Rather, non-milites expected to serve on campaign and called upon to do so by leaders with the legal jurisdiction to summon them. Moreover, both authors indicate that this jurisdiction was territorially based. For example, Berthold of Reichenau observes that in the summer of 1078, Henry IV dispatched Bishops Burchard of Basel and Thiepald of Strasbourg, noted above, to deploy their forces to ravage the lands of Duke Berthold of Carinthia. The chronicler comments that the military forces of the two bishops were comprised of two separate elements. The first of these consisted of the bishop's troops, that is, their milites. The second component consisted of rustici. These rustici, Berthold of Reichenau explains, were mobilized on the basis of the counties, comitatus, in which they lived. Moreover, these men were required to serve in this campaign because of the oaths that they had sworn to the bishops. That is, they were adjurati. The transfer of communal authority to German bishops, with the concomitant responsibility to mobilize the levies of the comitatus for military operations, dates back to the reign of Otto III in the late 10th century. The bishops of Strasbourg had enjoyed communal rights and undertaken communal obligations since this reign. The bishops of Basel had received specific communal authority in Augsgau and Siskau in 1041 from King Henry III. Consequently, the mobilization of these rustici is consistent with the ongoing practice of both Ottonian and Salian kings to utilize their bishops to undertake communal duties on their behalf. Berthold again draws a clear connection between territorially based mobilization of non-milites and the taking of oaths in his discussion of the mobilization of Franconian rustici who fought just a short time later, against Swabian, Carinthian, Bavarian forces under the command of Duke Welf of Bavaria and Duke Berthold of Carinthia, two of the leading rebel opponents of Henry IV. The latter were marching to join the Saxon army under the command of Rudolf of Rheinfelden, who was advancing into eastern Franconia. Henry IV was attempting to keep his Saxon and southern opponents from joining their forces, with the plan of defeating them seriatim. Henry therefore marched into eastern Franconia to repel the Saxons, whom he subsequently faced in the Battle of Mellerstadt. Concomitant with his own military operations, the king ordered the western Franconian Rustici to mobilize in an effort to delay Duke Welf and Duke Berthold. According to Berthold of Reichenau, these Franconians, whom the author denotes both as comprovinciales and rustici, were mobilized from their centuriae, that is, their local subcommunal districts. Moreover, he observes that they were bound together for military service by their oaths, that is, they were coniurati. Non-incidentally, Berthold also notes that these rustici were equipped with weapons of war, arma militaria, likely in contrast to farm implements such as scythes and pitchforks. This final observation permits the inference that these were wealthier rustici who could afford specifically military equipment. The purchase and possession of these arma militaria, moreover, would seem to be prima facie evidence of the expectations of these same men that they could be called upon to do military service. Lambert of Hersfeld, for his part, illuminates the legal and jurisdictional basis for the mobilization of men in Lotharingia and Saxony for military service. In discussing the army that King Henry summoned for operations in Saxony in the summer of 1075, Lambert notes that Duke Theodoric II of Upper Lotharingia and Duke Godfrey IV of Lower Lotharingia brought enormous forces to join the royal army. In fact, Lambert mocks the dukes for attempting to show off by standing out among the other princes on the basis of the size of their military contingents. In commenting on these troops, Lambert observed that the Lotharingians were very well equipped. The parallel with the Franconian Rustici noted above is quite clear. Lambert then explains that the two dukes had ensured the high quality of their military forces by imposing a very strict selection criteria on the men whom they mobilized, that is, they only picked the best men for campaign duty. Lambert explicitly states, moreover, that these men were mobilized from the regions over which the dukes had jurisdiction. Lambert's comments in this regard illustrate that Theodoric and Godfrey had the authority to mobilize troops because of their ducal offices. In addition to being territorial based, this authority to mobilize men had an intrinsic selection mechanism that allowed the two dukes to mobilize the men who were best equipped and best suited for service on military campaign. In light of Lambert's consistent effort to mention when particular magnates and militates were mobilized for military service, his failure to do so in this case indicates that the copii in question included large numbers of non-militaries. In one final example, Lambert describes the mobilization of a vast Saxon army in January 1074 to repel what the Saxons feared would be an invasion of their region by King Henry. Almost certainly exaggerating, Lambert claims that as many as 40,000 Saxons of all ranks came to the Vera River. This is the same force regarding which the author of the Carmen de Bella Saxonico, noted above, had claimed the mobilization of farmers, shepherds, and merchants alongside the milites. As it became clear that there would be no immediate invasion of Saxony, the Saxon leaders sent a substantial part of their army home. In discussing the demobilization of part of the Saxon force, Lambert specifies that 12,000 men of the lower social and economic status, plebei, were released. Lambert explains that these men in particular had been summoned with so little notice that they had not brought food with them and had to go home. The clear implication of Lambert's comment is that even men of plebeian status had the expectation not only of going on campaign outside their home villages, but that under normal circumstances they would bring sufficient supplies with them to be able to remain in the field for a substantial period of time. Conclusions. As the many examples of plebei, rustici, vulgus, gregari, viles personae, and mercatores treated here make clear, warfare in the 11th century, including combat operations, was not monopolized by milites, whether or not one wishes to construe such men as mounted feudal knights. In fact, non-milites played a central role in both battles in the field and in sieges. Indeed, they likely were the numerically preponderant element in any large army. It is notable that all of the combat operations that I have discussed took place during the course of Henry IV's reign, and most of these in the context of the civil wars of the 1070s and 1080s. One might conjecture on this basis that the mobilization of the Vulgus was the consequence of the enormous demands of the lengthy military conflict, and therefore essentially a return to the type of military organization that typified the Frankish Empire before the ostensible disappearance of military levies. However, such a conjecture would be incorrect. First, none of the authors discussed here give any indication that the mobilization of non-milites for combat operations marked a new or surprising turn of events. Rather, the opposite is the case, in that the mobilization of rustici is depicted as normal and as a well-developed practice. Second, the Vulgus and the rustici, as well as the mercatores, appear in both Saxon and royal armies right from the beginning of the civil wars in 1073, long before there could be any question of exhaustion and depletion of magnate military forces. The weight of the evidence for the deployment of non-milites during Henry IV's reign is largely an artifact of the production during this period of a large number of lengthy historical works, which devoted enormous attention to military matters because they were inspired by dramatic events during the final 3 decades of the 11th century. Finally, it should be observed that the main basis for the explanation of the elimination of levies as an important element in early medieval military organization is the claim that battles in the field, and moreover battles between mounted forces, came to dominate warfare. As all specialists in military history, well, at least all specialists not named Guy Halsall, are well aware, this was never true. Sieges dominated by warfare in both the Carolingian Empire and its various successor states. Henry IV's reign was actually quite conspicuous for the relatively large number of battles that were fought, with at least 5 and perhaps 6 between 1075 and 1086. Nevertheless, these battles were outnumbered by a factor of at least 6 to 1 by sieges, including operations against fortress cities such as Würzburg and powerful fortresses such as the Harzburg. In order to undertake these numerous siege operations, military commanders required far more troops than could be mobilized from among the milites employed by the magnates. Thus, the rustici and other non-milites of the 11th century continue to play the same role as their forebears had under the Ottonian kings, and before them the Carolingians and Merovingians as well. Thank you very much.